Trying to figure out exactly how far out to talk here for a second. I think that we're at a really pivotal age. If you could imagine how important language has been to the development of humanity, I think that we're actually in a very similar, we're stepping into a new kind of expressive capacity, being in an information age now, that in the same way that language has given us the capacity to create meaning, right, and share meaning and share many rich nuances of meaning and have kind of a whole rich landscape of meaning, I believe that currencies are actually the tools that we have to do that in the space of value. That there's very different rich value gradients, and we at the moment are speaking a language that essentially has one sentence in it, in the domain of currencies, and it associates that value with scarcity, and that part of what we have to do is actually increase our expressive capacity to be able to recognize these other forms of value and not just recognize them, make them visible, interact around them, if we intend to have thriving, sustainable communities, a thriving planet that actually has air for us to breathe and water for us to drink, food for us to eat. We actually have to shift around some of these value propositions. It's not even optional. And so for me, part of, the name of this panel is Monetizing Intangible Capital. And for me, it's actually more about recognizing actual value and stop thinking that this is somehow marginalized and intangible when it's very concrete and real. And the sort of this smoke and mirrors thing that we do with money, where we have this sort of artificial valuation, all these speculative markets, that in many ways is far less tangible. And so for me, I really like to kind of reset the value system, not by saying here's the correct one, but by increasing our capacities to be able to have currencies and systems that recognize different value gradients.
So what's really interesting, and you haven't used this word in our prep for the panels, so was the word scarcity. And one of the really interesting things about the knowledge era that we sometimes fail to recognize is the fact that knowledge is not a scarce resource. In fact, it's some economists make the argument that it's almost an infinite resource, that the more you use knowledge, the more you share knowledge, the greater it becomes, and the more valuable it becomes. And of course, economics as we know it is built on the concept of scarcity, and so you take scarcity out of the equation, and you have a pretty exciting world. So let's kind of move on to, and if you could each go into a little more detail and a little deeper about how do we make this value visible? How do we measure it? What are your perspectives on how to, if not monetize, to bring out the value and help use the value for creation of newer and greater value and innovation. So we'll start with you, Art.
I think there's actually a whole movement of this afoot right now, and I should first give a disclaimer that I use the word currency distinct from money, and normally in everyday speech we kind of collapse the two, but that monetary currencies or money is a subset of the overall range of currencies that we have. And for me, something like certified organic is actually a currency. There are rules by which it's issued. It changes value flows, it changes the way people shop, it changes the way production is done, and what it does is it makes something that would have previously been invisible. You have an apple, what's the difference between the way they were produced? Well, a certified organic sticker is peeling away part of that layer that might otherwise be considered intangible value embedded in the apple, and it's making it more tangible to the end user. And we use those kinds of currencies all over the place to mark those value flows. So I don't know, most of you probably remember when food was just food. It wasn't organic, GMO-free, locally grown, grass-fed, free range, like all these other things that we're doing now to actually try to make visible those parts of the process that actually matter. But in our pursuit of maximizing profits, we have forgotten some of those parts that matter, and now we're like putting them back in and adding tags to be able to make that deeper value visible to people.
That's a good point. Interesting. Right?
The discussion of scarcity, it's contextual, right? There is an infinite amount of knowledge and innovation and complexity that we can devise in our human relationships. Yet there is a degree of scarcity in the amount of resources available,
yeah.
right? And the amount of biodiversity, water, other kinds of factors. So in context, it depends on what kind of scarcity we're speaking of. You might look at intangible assets, but when you start looking down the lens of ecosystems and externalities that have not been brought into the current economic model, or the old economic model, maybe the current is more beginning to bring that in, you see opportunities and you also see potential liabilities. As an example, there's a group called True Cost that does a lot of research for investment advisors like myself that quantifies these externalities. They did a study in 2008, and they're introducing environmental valuations into the business mainstream. Out of the 3,000 biggest public companies, the world has ecosystem liabilities of $2.2 trillion, which could be potentially 30% of their combined profits. In other words, there's that recognition when corporations can see that, they can say, well, we can minimize that liability, and that potential liability reduction is a monetization form, and also to capitalize by creating innovations that move around that liability. In the case of Apple's organic, well, a company who's using organic, who's also being incentivized to keep the biodiversity of the region where the apples are grown healthy, is maybe has reduced the liability of polluting the biosphere, but also has an asset because they're increasing the fertility of the biosphere around the apple orchard. So those kinds of subtleties begin to start a conversation around these issues.